Egyptian hieroglyphics. The formation of ancient Egypt can mainly be attributed to its location along the Nile River. Each summer, the river's flooding would breathe new life into the valley, creating a lush oasis in the midst of the desert. Because of its geographic location, ancient Egypt also served as an important transit between East Africa and the Old World. It has been recorded that ancient man traveled the route between Egypt and Israel as far back as 1.8 million years ago. Ancient Egyptian history begins with the Paleolithic period and was recorded into 3 time frames. Lower Paleolithic, from 2 million to 100,000 BC. Middle Paleolithic, from 100,000 BC to 30,000 BC. And Upper Paleolithic, from 30,000 to 10,000 BC. Little has been preserved about this period of Egypt, mainly due to the environmental changes such as floods and erosion, but archaeologists discovered tools such as axes and blades they assume were used by early humans to forage the lush plants along the river. Now, following the prehistoric Paleolithic period in Egypt was the Naqada period. During this period, Egypt was divided into 2 regions, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt was defined by the area along the delta that emptied into the Mediterranean Sea. And Upper Egypt was the region located along a narrow strip of land south of the delta. It wasn't until the Naqada Third period where these 2 regions united through military conquests and the emergence of the Egyptian state occurred. It was in the tomb of the Upper Egyptian king Menes that the earliest samples of hieroglyphics were discovered. These hieroglyphics mainly depicted military battles and victories, and were scribed on pieces of pottery and clay labels. Additionally, early hieroglyphics were a court-centered system, used by royalty for both economic and administrative purposes. They appear on royal seals, impressions, labels, and pot marks to identify goods and materials for and by the newly formed Egyptian state. These hieroglyphics are referred to as seracs. Seracs are a format of the king's name and were comprised of phonetic signs and placed inside a palace facade surrounded by a falcon. The second documented use of hieroglyphics was on royal commemorative art. The Narmer palette depicts various persons and places that represent scenes that are symbolic to the king's rule. They were important pieces of iconography to solidify the king's power, and were oftentimes exaggerated or showed the king in clothing and his enemies in close to nothing. This creation of phonetic hieroglyphics was at the root of ancient Egyptian culture. It seemed from this point forward, a system of phonetic symbols, also called rebuses, began to flourish and were used to associate certain ideas expressed in particular pictures. However, the lack of any discernible use of vowels or consonants made it difficult for historians to interpret the hieroglyphic writing system. In August of 1799, during General Bonaparte's French campaign in Egypt, a young military officer unearthed a piece of black basalt, now referred to as the Rosetta Stone. On the stone appeared 3 types of writing: 14 lines of hieroglyphics, 32 lines of Demotic, and 54 lines of Greek. While the lines of Greek opened the door to understanding hieroglyphics, the writing was still difficult to understand. A. Barthélemy was the first historian to unlock an important key to interpreting Egyptian writing. Barthélemy proposed that the names of kings were enclosed in circles he called cartouches. Jean-François Champollion used this key and his understanding of Demotic and Greek script to deduce that if the Greek text mentioned King Ptolemy V, then the hieroglyphic signs contained in the cartouche ought to be a transcription of an Egyptian ruler's name. However, the Rosetta Stone was merely a starting point for Champollion to understand how to read hieroglyphics. It wasn't until 1819 and the discovery of Cleopatra's Needle that he was able to further understand the ancient Egyptian writing. The text on the needle contained the same sign for Ptolemy in a cartouche, but it also contained a second cartouche with a different name. By comparing similar symbols in the two cartouches, he was able to translate new letters that identified the name to be Cleopatra. So, how do you read Egyptian hieroglyphics? Understanding the translation of this writing system is complex. So, let's take a look at the basic phrase that confirms Champollion's system of translating the ancient Egyptian writing. On the Rosetta Stone, Champollion found the sign which he assigned the syllabic value MES, meaning to give birth to. However, this was just a theory, but his theory was confirmed in 1822 when he received a bas-relief drawing created by the architect Huyot. Huyot's drawing contained a solar disk in a cartouche, followed by 2 additional signs. The last of these signs was also contained in the translation of the letter S in Ptolemy's. Champollion then remembered that the sun was Ra, the Egyptian god. Champollion spelled out Ramesses, which was the name of the great Egyptian pharaoh. He continued this tireless deciphering of symbols for more than 10 years and traveled the globe to collect various texts that could help him in deciphering hieroglyphics. What he discovered was a system of writing that was partly phonetic and partly pictorial. Now, let's take a look at one more translation with the understanding of the phonetic and ideographic, or pictorial, system of hieroglyphic writing. The first 2 signs are phonetic letters. The symbol that represents a mouth is the letter R. The symbol of the owl represents the letter M. These 2 letters together are pronounced Rem, which is the Egyptian word for fish and is represented in the last symbol. All Egyptian hieroglyphics are based off this principle that the last symbol represents a picture of the word the previous symbols spell out. The influence of hieroglyphics is also apparent in other writing systems throughout history. Similar to Egyptians, Mayans and Aztecs in the New World used rebuses to depict names. However, hieroglyphics had the greatest influence in China and is still apparent in much of Chinese art. These hieroglyphics were the basis for ritualistic functions such as funerals, weddings, and prayers, and acted as visual aids for the person performing the ritual. In our modern culture, it's easy to view hieroglyphics as an ancient system of writing that has little to do with our 21st century society. However, the influence of hieroglyphics is still apparent in the designs of jewelry, fashion, and art throughout the world. While computers and mobile devices we use today are literally thousands of years after hieroglyphics, present-day communication systems such as Facebook, iChat, and texting have revitalized this ancient Egyptian writing system and brought the use of hieroglyphics into the 21st century.